Australia's major banks have come under fire for raising interest rates recently, but if you're a borrower, there may be more bad news on the way. The global banking regulator, the Swiss-based Basel committee, has flagged new capital rules will be announced in the next few weeks. But the committee is in the middle of its own internal arm wrestle, with the US wanting to throw out the risk-based models that allow some banks to determine their own capital needs. All that means the cost of borrowing is likely to keep moving in one direction, up. Neil Woolridge reports.
In the post-global financial crisis world, banking regulators are in a constant state of high alert. Authorities want a vibrant banking system to grease the wheels of global commerce, but they also need to ensure the unbridled risk-taking that caused the 2008 financial collapse doesn't happen again.
In the end, we want a pretty simple principle to hold, which is that the more risk banks have, the more capital they should hold.
But figuring out just how much capital they should hold is now the subject of a fierce international debate. Already, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority has forced the Big Four to put aside more capital, leaving them less money to lend. Now, though, a potentially bigger change is brewing, with the global banking supervisor, the Basel Committee, preparing to update its capital rules.
APRA's decision in July to increase the average risk weight for mortgages for the IRB or advanced Basel banks in Australia, including the Big Four, is actually consistent with where the Basel Committee is headed.
We'll wait and see what they bring down, and then we'll have to respond in a thoughtful way. So once again, it's a bit like competition, a new competition. Capital requirements, as they change, we have to be agile.
Last month, the chair of the Basel Committee, Stefan Ingves, flagged that its new capital framework should be announced by the end of the year. But inside the committee, an ideological tussle is reaching a head. The United States is leading a drive to do away with the system that allows so-called advanced banks, including Australia's Big Four, to determine their own risk weights and therefore how much money they should reserve for a crisis. The United States doesn't trust the bank's risk models and wants a more simple leverage ratio applied instead.
The issue is that when the crisis hit, some of these models didn't work very well. And the estimates that came out of the models about how much capital banks should hold turned out to be inadequate.
Mark Lawrence is a former chief risk officer at ANZ and now consults to some of the world's biggest banks. He says while it's not clear which approach the Basel Committee might take, it will involve a substantial change to the way Australian banks measure and calculate risk.
This will involve a lot of work from the banks and a lot of money to rebuild or build new models and test them and implement them and work with APRA to make sure that they meet the new requirements.
All of these local and global regulatory changes mean that the cost of banking in Australia is likely to become more expensive. But the question of who bears that cost, shareholders or customers, is another matter.
Well, look, some of it is passed on to shareholders as well, but the dilemma we've got is that we actually need to remain attractive to investors and to shareholders so that we can actually raise the capital in the first place.
Since the global financial crisis, Australia's major banks have enjoyed an average return on equity around 14%, a similar rate to other large Australian companies and the bank's global peers before the crisis. But last week, outgoing ANZ chief Mike Smith conceded that its ROE target of 16% was a bridge too far.
Yes, you can increase capital and you can make the banks safer, but somebody has to pay for it, and only two people can. The shareholders or the customers. And what we've tried to do is balance that.
But in raising mortgage rates over recent weeks, the Big Four have shown they still have enough pricing power that customers are likely to feel more of the pain than investors.
Shareholders until now seem very unwilling to accept a lower ROE. There's lots of debate about why that might be. So I think we need to see how that plays out. And certainly in Australia, it would appear that the Australian bank CEOs are trying to hold the line on the double-digit ROEs for the Aussie banks.
But in the new world of lower risk banking, it may not be long before Australian shareholders will have to accept lower returns.